Hey guys, Will here, welcome back to the channel. Now today's video we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be tackling I guess, accusation that has come out against Codemasters and the F1 2018 game in the last couple of days. So basically what's happened is somebody's come out saying that they found a link between the frames per second and tyre temperature and wear. So basically what this theory is saying is that over the course of about 5 laps, tyre temperatures are about 3 or 4 degrees higher at 60 frames per second than they are at 120 frames per second. Now 3 or 4 degrees might not sound like much, but as you guys that have done a lot of racing would know, about 100 degrees is the optimum tyre temperature for a lot of the softer compounds. And when you push that tyre temperature past 100 degrees up to 102, 3 or 4 degrees, the car becomes basically completely undrivable. So 3 or 4 degrees can be extremely significant, especially in the course of a race where you're managing tyre temperatures and wear as well. So it's a pretty serious accusation, and one that I think warrants a little bit more investigation. So while the video seemed pretty conclusive, the guy that made the video was basically just driving the car himself over 5 laps in both the different frame rates, so 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second, and then drawing conclusions based upon that driving. Now, there's a couple of problems with doing it this way, because obviously there are always going to be variances in the input that you're actually putting into the system. What I've found is a way to actually test this a little bit more scientifically using the AI to actually drive the car. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, this is pretty ridiculous. How could frame rate possibly have an impact on things like tyre wear and tyre temperature? So this is actually a thing. Now, I don't know exactly how the game engine works that Codemasters is using specifically for F1 2018, but I have done a bit of game development in the past, at a very amateur level, and I can tell you that this is actually the way a lot of game engines work. So what they do is they basically tie events to the frames that are being processed by the engine every cycle. So without going into crazy nerd levels of detail here, it is actually entirely feasible that the number of frames impacts the number of events that are being processed per cycle, and therefore may have an impact on things like physics and input and stuff like that. And that's actually part of the reason why a lot of people play first-person shooters at crazy high refresh rates that are way beyond what your eyes can actually see, because it does actually have an impact on input lag and stuff like that. So it is entirely possible that this is a thing. As I said, I don't know whether this is the way the Codemasters engine works, and I'm hoping that they'll actually watch this video and come back with an official response as well, because I do believe that it at least warrants a proper investigation to figure out whether this is actually a thing or not. So what we're going to be doing in this video is doing a bit more of a scientific test on this. We're going to be allowing the AI to drive the car in benchmark mode. We're going to be capturing the telemetry data out of the game itself and recording that so you can see exactly what's going on in real time in terms of temperature. So we'll be testing at 30 frames, 60 frames, 120 frames per second, as well as 50 frames and 100 frames per second as well. So we're capturing different intervals of frame rates as well. Now, while the AI in benchmark mode is pretty consistent in how it drives the car, there are still a few variables in terms of, track position, overtaking, proximity to other cars and things like that. So we will also be averaging our results across multiple runs as well, just to make sure that the numbers that we're seeing are consistent. So anyway, let's get stuck into the testing and see what we find. So I'll just quickly show you the settings that we're going to be using for our testing here, so you have an idea of exactly what's going on in the background. So our resolution is going to be 2560 by 1440, which is going to allow me to reach 120 frames per second with maximum graphics. So all the graphics are going to be completely cranked up for this, and we're not going to be changing those for any of the tests. VSync is going to be off because I haven't found that that makes any discernible difference between tyre temperatures at all. So we're just going to leave it off so that our maximum frame rate can be achieved at all times. Our frame rate limit is going to be turned on, and for the first test we're going to have it set to 120 frames per second, so we're limited to 120 frames. Now you will see at the top of the screen as well the frame rate will be displayed through the duration of the test. Now we're going to be showing the tests side by side as well, so you can see in real time exactly what's going on. So the first test that we're going to be doing is a 120 versus 60 versus 30 frames per second test. We'll do a couple of runs of 5 laps to compare the results between different runs. So all I'm going to be changing here in terms of settings is just my maximum frame rate. So we'll have 120 for one, 60 for another, and 30 for the other one as well. And that is enough to cap our frame rate and give us the results that we need.
says DRS has been failed when you are within 1 second of the car ahead, DRS zone.
So that is the first run concluded, and you can see there's definitely a difference between the different frame rates and their respective tire temperatures. So at around 120 frames per second, we have the best results with a maximum temperatures around about the 96 degrees on all four wheels. 90 frames per second, I've just got the results up on the screen here as well so I can see as I'm talking to you. So 90 frames per second, we saw around the 96, 98 degree mark, so 2 degrees warmer than 120 frames. 60 frames per second, it was a couple of degrees hotter again. We saw max temperatures around the 98, 99 degree. So a good 3 or 4 degrees hotter than we had at 120 frames per second. And then when we get down to 30 frames a second is where things start to get really crazy. So we were seeing max temps there of 100, 101 degrees. So a full 4 or 5 degrees hotter than we saw at 120 frames per second. So looking at this, it does seem to be pretty linear in its results in terms of the higher you go in frames, the lower the temperatures are. But the next thing we need to do now is do a second run in exactly the same conditions to see whether we get similar results. So let's jump in and do that now.
seconds.
So end of the second run, and as you saw, the results were very, very similar to what they were in the first run. Very, very, very minor variances in terms of how quickly the tyres heated up and the maximum temperatures that were reached as well. So again, we had around 100, 101, 102 degrees at 30 frames per second, and a maximum of around the sort of 96, 97 at 120 frames per second, with a couple of degrees variance in between on the other frame rate. So it's pretty easy to conclude from those two tests that the higher you go in frame rate, the lower the temperatures are within sort of 2, 3, 4 degrees. But what I found is that when I changed it to intervals of 25 frames per second, so 50 frames, 75 and 100 frames per second, things were quite significantly more amplified. So let's jump in now and have a look at the results of that test. Now we only need to do one run because we've already established that multiple runs don't really give us any additional data, but have a look at this now because this is pretty interesting.
so far is a 1:45.4. Race officials have enabled DRS. Race officials DRS has been DRS. DRS is now available.
So this is where things start to look pretty bad for Codemasters, I must say. 50 frames a second, we saw temperatures up to 105, 106 degrees on the tyres, whereas at 75 frames per second and 100 frames per second, we saw temperatures around the sort of 97, 98 degree and even 95, 96 degree mark. So they were pretty close between 75 and 100 frames per second, but there was a massive jump in temperature when you stepped it down to 50 frames per second, almost 10 degrees there, which is a massive difference. Remembering that, again, 3 or 4 degrees can be the difference when you're up around that 100 degree mark of a car that's got optimal grip versus a car that's completely undrivable. So my conclusion from this is that this is very, very, very significant data, and I really do hope that Codemasters look at this and come up with some sort of response. I wouldn't expect that they're going to be able to fix this for this year's version of the game, because this is something that I think is fundamental to the game engine. Obviously, there's some sort of link between the frame rate and the cycles per second that the actual physics are updating at. I don't know. I'm not gonna go out on a limb and say that, you know, I understand how the engine works, because I don't. But in my experience with game development, which, as I said at the start of the video, is quite amateur, I have, you know, seen the way these sorts of things can work in some engines. So this does kind of make sense from that point of view. But I'm not going to elaborate on that any further, because I don't want to throw egg at Codemasters' face, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm ratting on the game. I absolutely love this game, and I've put, you know, a good 200-300, almost 400 hours now into this game. But at the same time, you know, when you call yourself an esport ready game and, you know, a simulator game, this kind of stuff is, you know, it's concerning, especially when you consider that people that can't afford high-end machines are at a distinct disadvantage here. I mean, you know, if you're on your first stint on ultra soft tires and you're racing people that have got tire temperatures, you know, 5-6 degrees lower than yours, you're going to lose out every single time. So this is very significant data here. So look, guys, I'm going to leave it at that for this video. I'm not going to throw egg at Codemasters' face. I do absolutely love this game. But when you combine the problems that we've seen with, you know, things like desyncing and, you know, weird behavior of the safety car, weird flag behavior, weird track limits, you throw something like this on top of it that fundamentally changes your competitiveness, even in an environment where every other factor is stable. So, you know, you've got no glitches with track limits or anything like that. To have this much of a variation between different drivers trying to compete with each other is pretty unacceptable for an esport ready game. So over to you, Codemasters. I would really love to hear what your answer is to this, whether this is something that you know about or whether this is something that you're hearing about for the first time. And you guys as well that are watching this video, I'd love to hear your comments and what you think about this in the comments below as well. If you're a developer or maybe somebody that's been involved in the development of the Codemasters game engine, I would absolutely love to hear from you. But look, as I said again, I'm not trying to rubbish the game here. I absolutely love this game and I will continue to play it and enjoy it. But I'm definitely going to be making some adjustments to my game to make sure that my tire temperatures aren't being affected by this. Now, unfortunately for me, that's going to mean I'm going to have to run at a lower resolution on my 4K screen here, because I can't run 120 frames at 4K resolution. The technology just isn't there yet. So I would definitely encourage you guys to experiment around with this yourselves. Find the sweet spot for you as well. But this is definitely something that I think is significant. So look, guys, I hope you found the video interesting and useful. Obviously, a lot of effort has gone into producing this video. It's been pretty much a day's work. So I really do hope that you find it beneficial. If you have, please do hit the like button, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell as well, so you don't miss the next video. And I will see you guys again soon. Bye.